everyone. How can you hear me? Can you hear me in the back okay? Can you hear me all right in the front?
Absolutely.
All right, great. Well, hi, I'm Caroline Nagy, and I'm very honored to be here tonight and welcome you all to the James Connolly Forum. I'm here to introduce the speaker, and tonight's speaker, Samuel Stein, whose new book, Capital City, looks at gentrification and the rise to power of the real estate state. So there are few things more intimate and central to our daily lives than the spaces we live in, our neighborhoods, and our cities. If I ask you right now to think of home, you might have sentimental memories of family or memories of treasured local businesses, institutions. What you're probably not thinking about necessarily, unless you're already really into this stuff, is how the daily flows of capital shape every aspect of our built environment and our lives. There's few things that are so tightly controlled by the joint forces of regulation, finance, and the broader real estate industry, namely what Samuel together describes as the real estate state, and that's what he's going to talk to you about tonight. And so when we start thinking about cities and housing and the market forces that shape these, we really start to talk about and look at our communities in a very different way. So I was asked to talk a little bit about myself and why I'm here tonight. My interest in housing and housing justice does not come from an analytical place at all. It comes from a very sentimental place. I got my start working with people experiencing homelessness, and the reason that I do this work is based on a very strong moral indignation that such things could exist, that they're allowed to exist, that they happen, in this country at all. So I specialized in housing law and policy, and I've been working, in that broad area for the last 10 years. First in New York City, and then for the last year and a half, I've been here in Troy. Getting into housing policy and planning requires learning a whole new lens and way of looking at the world. The language of planning is really a language of the market, of capital, of zoning. You might feel sad, when a business that you've come to love that may have been around for generations is forced to close. You might feel sad when people are evicted from their homes and forced to move elsewhere. But in the real estate state, that's just sentimentality. What really matters is things like what should be funded and where, who gets to be where, and as always, who has the most money. The phrase highest and best use is really the closest thing planners have to a theory of what is good and right in the world. And the highest and best use, which Samuel discusses a lot in his book, really is saying that land is used best when it is occupied by the most resource-intense and expensive uses possible. So when we think about the real estate state and what we can do to unmake it, it really requires some radical thinking. And Samuel is a radical planner and academic, and he's here to upend this whole way of looking at the world and to, really unmake the real estate state. And so in this revolutionary spirit, who better to look for inspiration than James Connolly? See, this is the part where I introduce James Connolly. James Connolly came to the United States in 1902 and moved to Troy in 1903, setting up house at 96 Ingalls Avenue, a few blocks from where this forum takes place. His children picked up work by sewing and starching shirt collars. He worked for the Metropolitan Insurance Company until a recession caused his firm to falter. While here, he was active in the Socialist Labor Party, where he engaged in a notable dispute with its leader, Daniel DeLeon, over the, did I say it right? Well, he's dead though, so. Over the utility of fighting for wage increases. He was for this, James Connolly was for this, and other questions. The Troy branch of the SLP put Connolly on trial, but rather than expelling him, came over to his side and requested that DeLeon print a brilliant statement by Connolly proving how correct he was in the first place. He was a supporter of a strike by women workers here, but the hardships caused by the strike ended his insurance career and he left Troy. As most of you know, when he returned to Ireland, he played a leading role in great labor conflicts like the Dublin lockout of 1913, and led the Irish Citizen Army in its uprising against British rule in 1916. He was executed by the British as a result. Today, he is recognized as one of the great socialist leaders of the 20th century. And so before I move to introduce Sam and get to his wonderful talk, I would like to open the floor for announcements. Yes.
Hi, I'm Trudy Quay from Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace. On Thursday, June 6th, Joe Lombardo, Pippa Bartolotti, and Mas Robinson will be speaking at the Bethlehem Public Library at 7 o'clock. They've all been to Odessa, Ukraine for the 5th anniversary of the Odessa massacre. So it should be a really good talk. They encountered fascists while they were there. It's a really timely topic, so please join us. What's your name? My name? Trudy Quaife.
Thank you, Trudy. Next.
Yeah, also on next Thursday, on the 6th, the 2,000 nurses at Albany Med organized, voted for a union last year, and they're trying to get a contract while management continues to push for an open shop. And so we're having a rally from 4:30 to 7 in Washington Park. So you should come. And there'll be a Facebook invite as well.
When's this?
Next
June
Thursday.
6th.
Also on the 6th.
Thursday the 6th,
Next.
4:30 to 7.
Yes, please.
Yeah, hi. The next James Connolly Forum will be on June 21st with Matt Callahan and Yvonne Moore, the singers who, as some of you may know, were here before doing the James Connolly Songbook. Their new set is called Working Class Heroes, Songs of Working Class America. Should be very good and very interesting. In the fall, we're hoping to get Margaret Flowers and Kevin Zeese, who were two of the 4 occupiers that ended up in the Venezuelan embassy, who were arrested by the Trump administration for trying to protect the embassy from the so-called opposition in Venezuela. They're both well-known activists, and it should be a very interesting forum. That will probably, I haven't actually got a total confirmation yet, but it should be on Thursday, September 5th. And that will start our 9th season with that forum. I just want to explain a little bit about the donations for the forum. The forum contributes money every time to the Oakwood Community Center where this is being held. This is a voluntary organization, the Oakwood Community Center, and it needs our support, as well as a dinner for the speaker and some travel expense money for them too. So that's where the money goes. We're not trying to con you for money or anything like that. We're not making any money here. With that, I think we welcome you all. I see a lot of new faces. I welcome you to the forum series. I hope you come back.
Thanks. Any more? Looks like Oliver has something.
One quick announcement. We are going to be having an open mic Saturday, this Saturday at 7 p.m. at the United Preservation Association. So it's another former church that is now a community center. The open mic is going to be featuring Liv McKee, who's a queer spoken word poet. It's going to be pretty awesome. And if you do have a talent, artistically, verbally, like please come and share. You can sign up like through the Facebook event. You can contact Christoph DiMaria. He's the one that's scheduling. So 7 p.m. Saturday, United Preservation Association. It's a 548 Congress Street. So it's right past Cookie Factory up the hill.
Yes?
Yeah, the Sanctuary for Independent Media will be holding Community Freedom Fest on Saturday, June 8th. It's at 3361 6th Avenue in Troy. And they will have music, art, dance, featuring a special performance by Faye Victor and the Mutations for Justice. So that'll be going on this Saturday, 3 to 6.
Wait, Saturday, this is
The 8th.
the first.
The 8th, I'm sorry, the
Okay,
8th.
so.
The 8th.
2 Saturdays.
Thanks.
A lot going on. Anyone else want to make an upcoming announcement? Maybe someone about the new DSA chapter meeting, Dylan? No?
I don't know what that is.
David, okay.
The extremely organized DSA Detroit chapter will be meeting at 6:30, also at the Mount Ida Preservation Hall. You don't have to be a member to drop by.
What's ASA?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, DSA, Democratic Socialists of America.
When are you meeting?
6:30 p.m. On the 5th. So it's this coming Wednesday at Mount Ida Preservation Hall.
Thank you.
Well, since I'm here, there will be a Cuba caravan. They are pastors for peace and so on, go to Cuba and try to keep relations open. They'll be having a potluck at 5 p.m. on, I think it's Monday, June 17th. And that's going to be down at, let's see, 160 Central Avenue,
Yep.
Latin Center.
Oh, in Albany.
In Albany, yeah.
So much going on. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So I'll very quickly hand the mic over to Samuel. He's going to speak for about, he has a talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for quite a extended question and answer period up till 9. We do have a hard stop at 9. Samuel is the author of Capital City, Gentrification and the Real Estate State, which came out through Verso just this year. And this is a book that investigates what Samuel calls the rise of the real estate state, or the increasingly powerful faction of government that seeks to bend public policy towards ever-rising property values. His academic writing on planning and gentrification has appeared in the Journal of Urban Affairs, International Planning Studies, Metropolitics, and New Labor Forum, and has been featured in various edited volumes, including Zoned Out and Asian American Matters, and the soon-to-be-released Immigrant Crossroads and Political Landscapes in the Age of Donald Trump. His popular writing on New York City planning politics has been published in such venues as The Guardian, Jacobin, The Village Voice, RIP, City Limits, Gotham Gazette, New Politics, Progressive City, Progressive Planning, Urban Omnibus, and more. Samuel's a PhD student, a PhD candidate in geography at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, but he's also worked as an organizer, researcher, and planner. And it's through his work in the New York City housing policy world that our paths crossed briefly when we worked together on a research project on housing affordability, climate change, and displacement in New York City's flood-prone neighborhoods. Sam, in addition to studying and teaching and writing about planning and urban geography, Samuel is also a participant in various tenant and community groups fighting gentrification and displacement in New York City. So with that, I hope you can all join me in welcoming Samuel for his talk.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the James Connolly Forum. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you specifically to Sean Collins, John Flanders, and especially Carolyn Nagy. I'm here to talk about my book, which I'll give kind of a summary of many of the key arguments from it, and then we'll open it up for questions after that. As Caroline said, I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time after that. And there was a request for me to talk about myself at the beginning, so I have a note at the top that says, talk about yourself. So you got a little bit in the introduction. I don't live here most of the year. I live in Brooklyn, New York. I grew up in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, which in a lot of ways is a place much more like this than it is like Brooklyn. It's a post-industrial city outside of a bigger city that is trying to figure out how to remake itself, and where real estate capital is trying to reassert its hold on formerly industrial spaces, which seems to be a common theme here as well. My book is about gentrification, but it's also about urban planning. And I come to this as a student. I'm a geography PhD candidate, but I also studied urban planning, and I have a master's in that. And so I kind of learned how planning works, how planners think, what we're supposed to do. I never then went into becoming a planner for the state. I was a tenant organizer instead. And most of my motivation in becoming a planner was being mad at what planners were doing. I was I think like a lot of people, really inspired by the promise of planning, of creating more equitable and beautiful and sociable and environmentally sustainable spaces, and yet it was very clear that those projects were directly linked to gentrification, which is the return of capital to the city and the displacement of its working class residents. And I'm going to talk through some of how those processes work out, and a lot of it is kind of at like a macro or structural level, not because the other stuff doesn't matter, but because I think it's usually glossed over. But I'm not going to speak about it in academic terms. It's really quite clear what's going on. So what is going on? Obviously, the gentrification of cities. I live in New York, which is a highly gentrified city. I've been traveling to various cities talking about this book. I've been to Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, LA, Seattle, Providence, Vancouver, and Yonkers. Yonkers is the one that stands out from those in some ways, except for the waterfront, which looks very much like all those other gentrified cities. And so the same thing is happening in different ways, always in localized forms, but the same processes are replicating themselves in all those cities and many more. But it's important to say that gentrification is not like the only thing happening in cities in New York, in the US, in the world. It's actually a relatively small geographical area that's going through anything we might recognize as gentrification. Much more of the country is falling prey to extreme disinvestment. What's interesting or important is that these processes are fundamentally linked, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, and that there's a housing crisis on both ends. There's a housing crisis in the places that are becoming too expensive, and there's a housing crisis in the places that are going through disinvestment. In fact, the eviction rates are even higher in places suffering from disinvestment than places suffering hyperinvestment. So I wanted to learn a bit about Troy, and so this morning I Googled Troy and gentrification. And the first headline that came up said, "Is Troy the new Brooklyn?" ? And then the second headline said, "Troy is the new Brooklyn!" ! By which they don't mean, the place where Sam Stein lives, or like the center of Black Caribbean culture in New York, or any of these other wonderful things about Brooklyn. They mean the gentrified place that's becoming like hip in a very specifically expensive and profitable way. So I then looked at some of the census figures to get a sense of what's going on in Troy. I found that the median household income is about $41,000. And then I broke it down by race and found extreme inequality. So the average white household income, or median household income for whites, is $47,000. So that's significantly above the median. For Latinos, it's $32,000. For Asians, it's $30,000. And for African Americans, it's $24,500. So that's a discrepancy between black and white of $47,000 and $24,000. So an extreme racial inequality. Another interesting thing that came out of this was I saw that Troy and New York City have almost the same proportion of renters to owners. So about 63% of Troy residents rent, 37 own. That's like, we have slightly fewer owners in New York City, but very close. And notably, that's the inverse of the national. So the national proportion is just about the opposite, 2/3 own, 1/3 rent. So in Troy, as well as in New York City, we have 2/3 renting and 1/3 owning. There's a large number of vacancies in Troy, but the vast majority of them are neither for rent nor for sale. So I have some ideas about why that might be, but I'd love to hear your thoughts in the Q&A. It suggests possibly warehousing, possibly speculation, possibly something else. A quarter of renters in Troy moved to their current apartment since 2015. 3/4 moved since 2010. 3/4 of renters in the city moved to their current residence since 2010, which again suggests one of two things, or probably both. One is a demographic turnover and a lot of people moving in from other places, potentially Brooklyn, hence the headlines. The other is a high degree of churn. A lot of tenants being pushed from apartment to apartment to apartment, either because of predatory landlords who are evicting them, because they can't afford the rents, because the conditions are so bad that they move to a new place and then can't stay there and move to another. In any case, 3/4 of renters are in their place since 2010. And then the other thing I found is that the average renter in Troy is rent burden of your income in housing. And the general standard is if you pay 30% of your income or less, that's considered affordable housing for you. If you pay more than 30%, then you are rent burdened. And in Troy, the median pays 31.4% of their income to rent, so just above that threshold. So that's the average. That means that half the people are paying more than that. So then if we zoom out from the Troy area to the national, we see a lot of the same trends. So in the United States, homeownership is changing hands at a rapid pace, but the rate of homeownership is at a 50-year low. At the same time as we're at a 50-year low in homeownership, we're at a record high, has never been higher, in absentee owner sales. Sales to people who don't live in that house. So in 2016, we were at 37% of home sales going to absentee investors, 37%. And a whole lot of them are banks, hedge funds, or private equity firms. Blackstone is now the world's largest landlord. Here in New York, all across the United States, especially after the subprime crisis, in Europe, in Latin America, and elsewhere. And so as renting is rising, so are rents. The average move-in rents, as in the rent for a newly vacant apartment, in the United States has more than doubled over the last 2 decades. Wages have not come close to that kind of increase. In fact, they're mostly stagnant. So you've got stagnant wages and doubling housing costs, which means, again, we're back to rent burdens. The percentage of people's income that they're paying in rents are going up to disastrous proportions. And again, it's highly segregated, or it's highly segmented by race, and our neighborhoods are highly segregated by race. So the average rent burden in predominantly white neighborhoods in the United States is 31%, which is what it is in Troy, which, as I said before, is already considered unaffordable, and that's just the average. In predominantly black neighborhoods, the average rent burden is 44%. 44% of people's income. In Latino neighborhoods, we're talking about 48% as the average. That's just the average, so many people are paying much more than that. In New York City, every month, more than 2 million people are paying more than 50% of their income in rent. So that's, you can think of that as a dramatic cash transfer from your boss to your landlord that you never see. It just goes from one capitalist to another. It's true. All right. So then, we've got these terrible rent burdens, so a lot of people just can't afford housing at all, which has caused a spike in homelessness, which is not about mental illness, is not about drug addiction. Those things are components of homelessness, but the primary factor is people just can't afford homes. So we have a record high homelessness rate in New York City. The counted number is 70,000 people. It is likely higher than that. Nationally, it's generally understood that about 2 million people will at some point find themselves homeless this year. And another 7 million people are living in what we would call precarious housing. So sleeping on somebody's couch, tripled up in an apartment that shouldn't fit that many people. Again, in New York City and a lot of other places, we've seen a return of shift bed housing, which is not just renting an apartment, not just renting a room, not even renting a bed in a room, but a bed for a few hours. So you've got it for a few hours, then you go off to work and somebody takes your bed. They used to call that hot sheet apartments. This is like a practice of the industrial era that is now very much back today, except without industrial production in our city. So there's a lot of ways of explaining these phenomenon, of explaining just how things got to be this bad. The dominant explanations are that there's a mismatch between supply and demand, between the supply of housing and the demand for it. That's true, especially if we frame it as there is a deficit of affordable housing, or housing that's affordable to people who need it. There's also a demographic shift around the baby boom and around younger generation, therefore not getting access to home ownership opportunities. Sure, that's true too. But what's left out of those mainstream accounts is kind of the other side of the economic equation. It's not just about the deficit, it's about the surplus. And the surplus is of capital that's invested in real estate. So it's not just, and there is no deficit of housing as such. There is plenty of housing, there is not housing for the people who need housing. There are more vacant luxury apartments in New York City than there are homeless people, right? But the people who are homeless don't have access to those beautiful empty apartments. So I'm saying that there's a surplus of capital invested in real estate, and if we want to kind of quantify that or imagine what it is, the best figures that we have available are that there is currently 217 trillion, with the T, 217 trillion dollars invested in real estate around the world. And 217 trillion is just one of those numbers that's too big to imagine. So the way that Leilani Farha, who's the UN Special Rapporteur for the right to housing, describes this is, she says, imagine all the gold that's ever been mined anywhere in the world at any time, all pooled together. This $217 trillion is all of that value times 36. So that's the value of real estate. The even more salient fact is that real estate makes up 60% of the world's hard assets. So 60% of the world's capital, if it's invested in something, 60%, a majority, is invested in real estate. And there's been times in the past when capital has been heavily invested in land, but often that was agricultural land or land for other kinds of production. It is historically unique, this moment that we're living in, when a majority of the world's capital is invested in urban real estate. And how do we know that it's urban real estate? 3/4 of that capital is housing. So it's not even just sort of like real estate in the abstract or the kind of land grabs that we hear about in Brazil and the Philippines and other places. Yes, those things are happening, but where the real concentration of capital is urban real estate. It's our homes. So there's a lot of reasons why capital is converging in land and buildings. I'm not exactly an expert in that, but just to give a few of the frameworks. One way to think about it is that we went through a long period of financial deregulation in this country, which specifically allowed banks to do all sorts of weird and crazy things, and the predominant asset that they could play with was mortgages. And that's, we're all familiar with what happened in 2008 with the subprime mortgage crisis. So the rules on banking were opened up, specifically around what you could do with housing, and so tons of money flooded into housing to use it as a tool of speculation. We also had a long period, continue to have a long period, of low federal interest rates, which are in some ways good for the working class, but also encourage this kind of investment because you're not making any money by saving, you're not making any money in treasury bonds, you're looking for something else to make money with, and real estate will be that quick return, especially luxury real estate, right? We're not talking about like long-term investments in affordable housing, we're talking about quick returns on investments, building kind of crappy, shiny gold boxes. Glass boxes, excuse me, gold trimmings. We've also seen quantitative easing in the United States, which was a complicated way that the US got itself out of the 2008 crisis. Involved purchasing toxic assets from banks, a lot of which was property, by the way. But the effect of it was to create money out of thin air. So the Federal Reserve created money in the bank accounts of the banks. Suddenly they had money to spend. What did they want to invest it in? Real estate. We also had massive urbanization programs in the United Arab Emirates, in China, and other places that could serve as sort of sops for capital. David Harvey, the geographer, likes to point out that since 2008, more concrete has been poured in China than was poured in the rest of the world previously. Just in China, just since 2008. That's basically his explanation for why we don't have a continued crisis, is China saved the world. And not in an altruistic way necessarily, but that is a lot of capital going into real estate. We also have...
Don't they have tons of buildings with no one in it, like whole cities?
They do have what they call ghost cities.
Really?
Yeah, but that's also a part of moving people out of rural areas and into cities, which is a global phenomenon of making subsistence agriculture less and less possible. And as you corporatize in some countries and collectivize in others, you push out the small farmers and they have to go to the cities, and so that housing is waiting for them. So we've also had a proliferation of predatory equity funds or private equity funds that act in a predatory manner that are scouring the globe for what they see as undervalued investments. And a lot of times that undervalued investment is our home, especially if we live in some sort of affordable housing, like a rent-stabilized apartment like I live in, or an affordable co-op, that they can somehow bend the rules to get it out of that affordability program. They can make a ton of money. So we've seen that happening. There's the general economic polarization that we've seen all over the world. The concentration of wealth in a 1% or a 0.1% or a 0.01% or whatever means that a few people have a ton of money that they need something to do with. And a lot of times they want to have geographic diversity of that tons of money in case there's political instability wherever they are. And so they spread it out. And they buy condominiums all over the world as a way to make money, but also just to park money or launder money, in the case of Paul Manafort, Trump's former campaign manager. And then there's even more explanations beyond that. But I think the summary way of putting it all together is we're living in a situation when capital gains are rising, while the rate of profit in many other industries is falling. Capital gains are going up, profitability generally is going down, and so capital switches. Capital moves from those once profitable industries and puts itself into another sector. That sector has been real estate. And it becomes sort of the last stop in this road. There aren't many places you can go after land. It's pretty fundamental. Glenn Beck wants us to invest in gold. But other than that, land is kind of where you go when everything else fails. So viewed in that light, we can see that the force behind all those trends I talked about before is the growing centrality of urban real estate to capital's global growth strategy. Through that process, the price of land becomes a central economic determinant, as in the thing that determines what other economic activity can happen anywhere, as well as a dominant political issue. The term gentrification, which is kind of clunky and many syllables, becomes this household word, and displacement is an everyday fact of life. Housing becomes a globally traded financial asset, which then creates the conditions for simultaneous booms and busts around the world, which is terrifying. Government, and particularly at the municipal level, becomes increasingly obsessed with raising property values and then redistributing wealth upward through land and rents. And of course, we have real estate developer Donald Trump, first as a celebrity and now ultimately as president. And if you take that all together, you get the rise of what I'm calling the real estate state, which is a political formation in which real estate capital has inordinate influence over the shape of our cities, the parameters of our politics, and ultimately the lives we lead. So this real estate state is not a new thing. As long as there's been states and private property, there's been interests around using the state to increase the value of property. It's also not all-encompassing. There's plenty of other things going on politically. It doesn't displace the police state or the warfare state or the carceral state or even the welfare state, though it tries. Those things coexist. But the real estate state is increasingly important and powerful. And what I think we are seeing that's new is the incredible power of real estate over our political lives. So city planners kind of are an interesting way of getting into all these dynamics because they're sitting in the middle of it. They are public servants who represent the people, but they also make decisions about land that is largely privately owned, and under these conditions is a huge investment for a whole lot of people. And so they're sort of like the combination of state, capital, and popular power all at once, and they're managing the levers of urban change. They're making crucial decisions about land use especially, but also transportation, housing, and the environment, and even more. In a lot of places, planners are tasked with a contradictory goal. I see one planner in the audience right now. The contradictory goals are inflating real estate values while also safeguarding residents' best interests. And in a place like Troy, most of those residents are renters. So that's a contradiction, right? You can't consistently raise property values while also looking out for the interests of renters. Capitalism never made planning easy, but today's urban planners face an existential crisis. If the city is an investment strategy for the global 1%, what exactly is their job? Are they promoting public values, or are they wealth managers for those who own the city's land and buildings? Under those conditions, planning is defined by simultaneously incredible dreams and stultifying realities. Their mission is to imagine a better world. Their day-to-day work involves producing a more profitable one. They almost universally espouse a commitment to pluralism and diversity, but by the last survey, the profession is 58% male and 81% white, which puts them demographically enormously out of step with most of the cities that they plan. Most planning offices are structured to build continuity over changing administrations, but there are still ways that political priorities make their way into the planner's daily work. The money that planners have to work with is largely derived from property taxes, which is an arrangement that incentivizes developer and homeowner-friendly policies and restricts the amount of land that can be given over to truly public uses. And while planning is a public function, planners in capitalist cities are always at the mercy of the market, since most of what they do is regulate private actions. And so then we have this private land market, and that's where I think the heart of this problem really lies. The private land market is essentially a spoils system. Whoever owns the land keeps the accrued benefits that planners and other social actors create, whether or not the owner is responsible for them. With so much global capital invested into real estate, planners are facing enormous pressure to stoke land markets and enable gentrification. Their charge is to find creative ways to raise property values, either because they are low and landowners want them higher, or because they are already high, and if they start to fall, the budget falls apart. Any seemingly technical discussions of growth, density, and urban form are therefore always also shaped by that imperative. Planners are not just shills to real estate, though. They can and generally want to make spaces, as I said before, more beautiful, sustainable, efficient, and sociable. But without control over the land, the result of their work is often higher land prices, increased rents, and ultimately displacement. As some places endure that kind of land market inflation, others fall prey to disinvestment. The land loses its exchange value. Residents are shut out of the credit markets. Buildings fall into dangerous disrepair. All of this leads to a landscape of radically uneven geographical development between capital-flush cosmopolitan centers and investment-scarce cities. Even within cities, the same inequalities are always evident from neighborhood to neighborhood. You can even see it on the level of a block, with some buildings getting a bunch of money and others falling apart. You can sometimes see it within the same apartment building, with some apartments getting fixed up while others are left to wither. Gentrification cannot be a universal phenomenon. Money tends to come from one place and go to another, creating chaos on both ends. On the disinvested side, communities face terrible choices. Many want the benefits of good planning, like safe streets, clean air, decent housing, but not the catastrophic tide of capital that it summons. In these places, residents will often reject planners' interventions out of a well-founded fear that they will be kicked out of their neighborhoods before they could ever enjoy the promised improvements. That's the problem as I see it. Under the current conditions of largely private land ownership and a massive concentration of capital into real estate, it's really difficult to decouple urban planning from gentrification, or at least its pursuit. It can be done, certainly, but it requires an intentional approach, which not many US cities are currently pursuing. I'm going to look at the time to make sure I'm on track. Okay.
You're good.
So then we get to this question, why do capitalist cities plan? Isn't the market supposed to just sort of take care of everything, right? That's the capitalist ideology. Planning, therefore, is actually really useful in undermining that. First of all, it's quite clear that markets require coordination. They require it in terms of legal, logistical, infrastructural, and technological interventions. Second, planners are supposed to maintain the spatial dimensions of racial inequality, which is fundamental to capitalism. So planning is not inherently racist, and in fact, it's a big part of the way out of racism, but racial capitalism asks planners to sort out who will go where, under what conditions, and for whose benefit. Another demand that capitalism makes on planners is the establishment and reproduction of state power, which means securing popular consent through the built environment, right? You go places that you're sort of channeled to go, and you don't go where you can't. Whether there's a highway in the way that splits up a neighborhood, or a wall, or a fence, or a border. Also, the tools of planning to communicate the idea that what those in power are doing is inherently rational and in your best interest. So there's kind of like an ideological element to it as well. There's also a demand from capital that the state take on a larger and larger share of the burden of what we call social reproduction, which is everything that goes into making sure that people survive to live another day, and especially to work another day, and then into the next generations. So that can include access to food, transportation, housing, healthcare, education. All of these are things that capital demands that the state take care of, at least to some degree. And under the conditions we're living in, the state is taking care of it to less and less of a degree, which means the burden goes on us to figure out how we're going to pay for these things. And then finally, capitalism demands that planners manage the contradictions of land in our society, which is a social resource that is largely privately owned with the expectation of profit. So planners are responsible for making decisions about what can be built where on land that they don't own. There's a book about this called Planning the Capitalist City by Richard Foglesong that came out about 35 years ago that looked at that particular contradiction around land and came to some really interesting ideas about what exactly planners do. And the book goes from the colonial era up to the 1920s. And Foglesong said that it was planners' role to manage that contradiction between the social character of land, as in it's all out here, right? We can see it, we can access it, but it's privately owned. But the owners demand certain things of the state. And once that happens, you get two contradictions. The first contradiction is called the property contradiction. And what that is gets back to the initial premise I had, which is that capital demands all sorts of things from the state, but is also really wary of state intervention. Right? They want the state to take care of a bunch of things, but they don't want the state to do anything that gets in the way of their bottom line, their profitability. Where it gets interesting is that real estate capital and industrial capital, which are the two predominant forms in urban life, have different demands of the state, and sometimes they're contradictory. So for example, industrial capital tends to want cheaper land. They don't make money off of land, they make money off of the thing that they make on top of land. And so for them, land is a cost factor. They tend to support cheap housing for working class people. Not because they're so great and altruistic again, but because if their workers are paying tons in rent, then they're going to start demanding higher wages. So as a way of suppressing wages, they might support rent control. They might support the state taking on the function of public housing, because it brings down their workers' cost factor. Real estate capital, of course, has no interest in either of those things, right? They want land, the value of land to go ever upward, because that's how they make their profits. They certainly don't want the state getting involved in restricting how much rent they can charge to workers. So that's one contradiction. You also have a contradiction around environmental policy. Industrial capital wants to pollute anything it wants wherever it wants, no restriction. Real estate capital tends to support certain kinds of environmental regulation if it makes their spaces more clean and beautiful and rentable. Right? If you can develop on a former brownfield, they'll support that. So that's another contradiction between real estate and industrial capital. The people, of course, have an entirely different set of demands of the state. The planner's job was to basically to mitigate between those two factions of capital while also taking care of the people enough to maintain their own legitimacy. And that enters us into the next contradiction, which Foglesong calls the capitalist democracy contradiction, which means in a formal democracy, like we have, a bourgeois democracy, we get to vote. And so the state needs to maintain the legitimacy of at least most of the population. And so they need to do enough for the people while simultaneously maintaining capital's bottom line, because that's the fundamental premise of their job. So that's tough, right? How are you going to satisfy the demands of the people while also satisfying the demands of their bosses if those demands are opposite? And the way that they manage this contradiction, they never resolve it, but the way that they manage it is through participatory planning processes, bringing the people into the process, but limiting the parameters. So we involve the people in the decision making, but you have the choice between A and B. C is off the table, and not doing anything is also not an option. But you can choose A or B. We have planning commissions that are publicly appointed members of the community that get to have a say over what's going to happen in terms of land use, zoning, development. Often, however, those commissions are stacked so that they are majority capitalist, if not entirely representatives of industrial and real estate capital. So the process is opened up, but it's closed, right? It's open, but it's rigged. So that's the capitalist democracy contradiction. I say all this because that's the way planning has worked in the US for a very long time. One kind of important thing changes during the time that Foglesong was writing that book, which was his dissertation before that, which has gone on to change even more in the years since, which is that there's no longer a very strong sector, industrial sector, in the middle of our cities, right? Deindustrialization, which probably should better be understood as the geographical redistribution of industry, because the world we're living in is more industrial than it's ever been. It's just that the industry happens in different places than it used to. But if we call it deindustrialization, because that's how it feels locally, our cities, our inner cities have been deindustrialized. And that happened in two waves. The first wave occurred from 1947 to 1973, and that was largely factories moving out of the central cities and into the surrounding suburbs, or what we call exurbs, even further out, or moving to the US South and taking advantage of Jim Crow laws and also right-to-work laws. So the first wave is 47 to 73, and then there's an even bigger wave from 74 into the 90s, where more plants are leaving, and plants are leaving the US altogether. Here in Troy, of course, this was an industrial center, first of iron and steel, and then in textiles. There's a great deal of wealth here, which means that there's also a beautiful built environment from that time of wealth. And then industry leaves, and from what I understand, it happened somewhat earlier than in many other cities. So this has all sorts of effects on our cities, as we know, in terms of concentration of poverty and unemployment, in terms of union busting, in terms of the tax revenue and everything else. But it has really severe impacts on planning that aren't always discussed. So if we go back to that property contradiction, where capital is making a set of contradictory demands of the state, well, they're no longer contradictory. There is no industrial capital that's making a different set of claims than real estate capital, right? Nobody from the capital side is arguing for lower land values and rent control. It's just real estate capital that is making those demands, and then the rest of us on the other side trying to fight back. But we're in a structurally disadvantaged position vis-a-vis where we were before. If we think about that capitalist democracy contradiction, well, those city planning commissions are now largely real estate capitalists. There's not even a division of capitalists on the commissions. The New York City Planning Commission, every single member is currently or has a history in the real estate business. The one good person who usually votes how I would want her to is a nonprofit developer. She's still a developer, right? She's just a nonprofit developer. So we have these open processes, but they're driven towards ends that are good for the real estate industry. So when industry leaves these central cities, it creates a vacuum, and really creates three kinds of vacuums. The first is a political vacuum, which is what I'm talking about in terms of real estate capital dominating the urban political discourse and the set of demands coming from capital on the state. There's also, of course, an economic vacuum. There's all sorts of jobs that are lost that have to be found in other sectors. And in a lot of places, it's some version of what we call FIRE that replaces it. FIRE stands for finance, insurance, and real estate. That's certainly the case in New York City. It's also the case in many other places, many other post-industrial cities. New York City lost 750,000 manufacturing jobs between 1950 and 1990. So that's a huge vacuum. and it's a huge opportunity for real estate. And it gets played out through a spatial vacuum. Industry leaves the city and leaves behind all this space, all this industrial space. And some of that gets converted as industrial space into luxury lofts or retail spaces that are in former industrial sites. Others are just torn down and rebuilt as those shiny glass towers that we're all familiar with. But in either case, there's this spatial vacuum that real estate capital can come in and fill. So that's kind of another way of understanding how we got to the place we're at, where we have this rise of the real estate state at a moment of what one actually rather centrist economist calls a Niagara of capital into real estate. Many cities have seen their housing prices balloon over 50% in the past 5 years. And gentrification is becoming the regular outcome of what is considered good urban planning. Right? Space is made nicer, and then who benefits from it? Whoever owns the land, which increasingly is a pool of speculators. So gentrification is often understood through two frameworks. One is production, and the other is consumption. That's generally how we talk about any kind of economic process, especially for Marxists. So the production side of gentrification looks at who is producing gentrification. It's the developers, it's the landlords, it's the bankers who are financing the product. The consumption side of who is making gentrification is who's buying those properties, who's moving into those spaces. And that's where we get to the discourse around the hipsters and the yuppies and the new bourgeoisie, or whatever you want to call them. And in truth, both sides need to be there for this process to work, right? Just like any other kind of economic calculation, if you have production without consumption, then you have a failed investment, right? Somebody put money into a project and nobody bought it. If you have consumption without production, then you have unmet demand. You have a bunch of yuppies who want to move to a place, but there's no nice housing for them. So then it becomes the role of the state to ensure both of those things. Right? They ensure the production side of gentrification in a number of ways that I'll describe in a moment, but through incentives to developers. They ensure the consumption side through all these kind of lifestyle amenities, the nice things that those kinds of people like to have in their cities. Coffee shops.
Right.
Harder for the planners to make a coffee shop, but they can make like a retail boulevard where the spaces are so large that no small business could ever fill them. So what exactly are planners doing to encourage gentrification? A big one is tax incentives, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. Amazon was kind of like the most absurd example of this, where every city was offering to give away its entire tax burden to them. We call this geo-bribery, bribing companies to come to a particular geographic location. And it's competitive. Cities are competing against one another for capital to land in their particular location and not others. Someone, Dan Denver, pointed out to me that we could also call this Geo Extortion. That capital is extorting the cities to say, you better give us what we want or we won't come to you. It's certainly a two-way process that both sides seem happy to engage in. So we've got geo-bribery as one main tool that planners or the state uses to encourage gentrification. Another is privatization. Privatization of land and buildings. Taking private land, giving it away to developers, and telling the rest of us that this is somehow in our best interest. Sometimes that means privatizing public housing, which in many places is the last remaining source of very affordable housing. Sometimes it means privatizing public lands that were used for parks or other public purposes in past. Hospitals. New York City's hospitals are closing at an absurd rate. It's like as if we don't fall down and die. Like we need hospitals, but we keep privatizing them and turning them into luxury condos. Our mayor got arrested while he was campaigning the first time around, protesting one of these, and then just continued doing it once he won the election. Deregulation is a big part of this also, specifically deregulation of rent controls. Rent controls which were a part of many cities' public policies, especially in the post-war era. There are many states that now just preempt this and say, you can't have rent control. Luckily, New York is not one of them. We still have rent control in New York City, parts of Long Island, parts of Westchester, and parts of Rockland County. But those laws have been severely limited, and at the moment, we're not allowed to expand it beyond those. I'll come back to that later. We also have the corporatization of street life, turning streets over to private management, like business improvement districts, which are kind of like private governance by landowners. They get to put a little bit of their own money into a pot and then make decisions about the life on the street. They can hire their own private security to police it. They can put up their own decorations. They can enforce that everything look the same, etc. Zoning. Zoning is a huge part of what planners do. In fact, it's too huge a part of what planners do. It's become the tool by which many other things are achieved. Zoning is the rules that planners create for what can be built where and at what height. So it's about use type, which means like industrial, commercial, residential, or some mix. And it's about size and density. How big can buildings be? How much space does there need to be between them? A lot of cities are going through processes of upzoning, which means increasing development capacity, saying in a particular neighborhood or block or even parcel, more can be built in this place. That creates enormous value to whoever owns the land. So like, whereas before maybe you could rent out 6 apartments, now you can rent out 60. Imagine the wealth that was just created by the state and handed over to the landlord in that context. You also see downzoning, which is limiting the amount that can be built in certain places. This is very often concentrated in the richest and whitest sections of every city. And it can also lead to increased property values, because if you downzone an area, you might say nothing bigger than this can ever be built here. And so the thing that exists there now becomes very valuable. And so by either upzoning or downzoning, planners can in different ways drive up land and property values. You also have an uneven provision of public services. And this goes in all different directions. Sometimes you see the state prioritizing public services, meaning transit, meaning sanitation, all that basic stuff, education. Sometimes they basically give the nice stuff to the rich neighborhoods and keep it from the poor neighborhoods. Sometimes they seem to move it into the poor neighborhoods as they are starting to gentrify. So the richer people show up and suddenly the trash pickup gets better. Sometimes they channel it into the poor neighborhoods and then it seems to be summoning capital to those places. Like, look, real estate investors, now the schools are better. So whatever they do in those cases, under these conditions where real estate is looking for an opportunity everywhere, the real estate capital will take advantage of those uneven public service distributions. And then finally, and crucially, this is not something that planners do, but it's something that they rely on, and that's aggressive policing. Police departments are completely separate agencies. They have different budgets, they have different cultures, etc. But a lot of planned gentrification assumes that there will be aggressive policing in these newly gentrified areas in order to make the new investors or owners or residents feel more comfortable in those locations. So during the period of intensive stop and frisk in New York City, the places that had the most stop and frisks were not the exclusively white areas, we know, but they also weren't the exclusively Black and Latino neighborhoods. They were the gentrifying neighborhoods, the places of social interaction. That's where the most stop and frisks were, to clear that terrain for the arriving wealthier, whiter people. And we've seen, there was a study that came out on this last year, police departments all over the city are going to their mayors, their city councils, and they're trying to prove that what they're doing is effective by showing an increase in property values. They say, look, the property values are going up. This stuff is working. So the police understand what they're doing, whether or not the planners understand their relation to the police. So I could go on and on and on about this, but it's time to talk about what we might do about it.
Yes, please.
So that's the big question. I have some thoughts. I am assuming and hoping to God that you all have some others. I don't have an answer, in part because there isn't an answer for this everywhere. It's different in different places. But there's a lot that can be done, and we should be not only thinking about this, but acting on it. The most important thing to talk about right now because of where we are and what time of the year it is the rent laws. So New York State's rent laws are about to expire. June 14th, I think, is the expiration date. Do you know? No, that's all right. I think it's the 14th. It's very soon. So rent controls in parts of the state. And that is not enough, but it's really important in those places. And it's important, obviously, because it keeps the rents relatively stable. It gives people guaranteed lease renewals, so you know that you're going to have a chance to stay in your apartment, which is important in and of itself, but it also leads to an increase in organizing. If you know that you're going to be given a lease as long as you're paying the rent, then you don't have to worry about, will it piss off my landlord if I start organizing with my neighbors? So this is really important politically. And then finally, it's really important from a planning perspective too, because if we, the people, create all sorts of social value, and our planners do nice things, right? They increase transit, they build new parks, the value of the land goes up. And absent rent controls, the landowner will just translate that into rising rents. Rent control then is really crucial for putting a stop to that machinery. The land value might go up, but the rents can't go up just because of that. So it's really important. And it expires, I have June 15th in my notes, so let's say that that's the day. June 15th, cool. There is a big day of action in Albany on Tuesday, on June 4th. There's going to be actions all day, all over the city, including a lot of direct action, if anybody's interested in getting arrested. That's the place to be. And you can look at Housing Justice for All to see the kind of mainstream platform. And I was a tenant organizer in 2012. This platform is way better than anything we ever fought for in the past. It's really like a qualitative leap from where we were. It's not where we need to go. Like obviously we need a lot more, but it's way better than what we used to fight for. And so there is something called the Upstate Downstate Housing Alliance that is coordinating this. It's a very clever formation of both upstate tenant and homeowner groups and the traditional downstate tenant organizations. And they've put together a platform that in theory has key victories for all different types of tenants and at-risk homeowners, upstate and downstate. Everybody from rent-controlled tenants to public housing tenants to homeless people to mobile home residents to working-class homeowners at risk of foreclosure. And the idea is we want it all. We're not going to allow the downstate interest to be played against the upstate interest, or the upstate interest to be played against the downstate interest, because that's been the history of the housing movement for like 70 years in New York. One of the pieces of legislation that is up for a vote by June 15th is an expansion of the Emergency Tenant Protection Act, which is the thing that gives us access to rent stabilization in the first place. We were talking about this over dinner. It doesn't seem like expanding that into Rensselaer County is either particularly politically viable right now or would be a great benefit to tenants in Troy, because the types of buildings here aren't the types that are covered by that protection. So we can put that aside for a minute. But there's another bill that's in this package, which is the one that's been most targeted by the landlord lobby and the one that the Democrats seem most likely to jettison, which would have a huge impact on renters in Troy. And that has the unfortunate name of good cause eviction. I say unfortunate because there is no such thing as good cause for eviction, but it's like some cause eviction might be the better name for it. And what that means is landlords can't just evict you because they want to. They have to offer you the option of renewing your lease. And they can't raise the rent to whatever they want it to be. There's a limit on how much it can go up, which has to do with the inflation rate and the cost of running property. So it's kind of like a limited form of rent control that would be applicable to almost all renters in New York State, if not all, but certainly not just the ones that are covered by the ETPA right now. So that's a really important action that can be taken right now, like Tuesday, that all of us in this room can, perhaps lend our support to. But there's a whole lot more that we can do. We need to fight for policies that seek to cool or even kill speculative land markets, and not just keep on inflating them and then asking for something in return. That's been the predominant mode, is we increase the value of land and the opportunities for speculation, and then we ask something back from the speculators. Like, sure, you can build up that condo complex, but you're gonna have to build us a park, or you're gonna have to create some affordable housing that goes along with it. We want parks and affordable housing without luxury giveaways, because the luxury giveaways will make our entire city more expensive, and we're not going to be able to access that park, and a few lucky people will get affordable housing, and chances are it's not that affordable anyway. We need to get out of that model of doing things. Second, or third, cities have to adopt policies that facilitate the transfer of land and buildings from private ownership to public or collective ownership, which might sound crazy, but it actually happens all the time already, it just only happens for the wealthy. But there are ways of doing it. So, for example, when property owners fail to pay taxes, what happens in New York City and a lot of other places right now is that the city puts a lien on it, and then they bundle a bunch of liens together and sell them to a speculator, which is just terrible, right? That's like a lose-lose-lose situation for the public. There is legislation that's been written but not adopted that would instead turn each of those sites into a community land trust. That would mean like 4,000 new community land trust sites a year in New York City alone. Cities can pass right-to-sell bills, which would give households at risk of foreclosure the opportunity to sell their home to the city, which would then operate it as public housing or turn it over to one of these community land trusts. Cities can also institute a right of first refusal on home or especially apartment building sales. This exists right now in Paris, where the city has the first right of refusal on properties that are going for sale in gentrifying districts. They can just buy it up, and then they can hand it over to, not developers, but the public. Washington, D.C. has kind of a version of both these laws. They call it TOPA and DOPA. Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act and District Opportunity to Purchase Act. So in an apartment building that's going for sale, the tenants have the first right of refusal on it. They can buy it out. And if they turn it into a limited equity co-op, which means a cooperative where you can't sell it for more than you bought it for, they get extremely advantageous tax rates from the city. It used to work really well, it worked in the 80s. It doesn't work anymore because the properties are too expensive for anyone to buy it out, which means we need bigger subsidies or we need other policies that tamp down the value of the properties in the first place. We need to fully fund public housing. That is easier said than done, but we already spend tons and tons and tons of money on housing, just not housing for poor people. So we spend roughly $200 billion on housing in the United States, just in terms of public investment. Most of that is the mortgage interest deduction. 85 billion of that goes to families making over $100,000. So we're already spending $85 billion subsidizing homeowners who make up more than $100,000, and yet supposedly we have no money to fund public housing. We spend $7 billion on public housing. So that's $85 billion to homeowners making more than $100,000 and $7 billion on public housing nationally. So the money is there, not to mention our military budget and all that other horrible stuff. We need to rethink the relationship between real estate and taxes. We have this problem where a lot of our city revenue comes from property taxes, and therefore it's in the city's interest to raise property taxes all the time. This can lead to real serious service discrepancies between places with high property values and low property values that then correspond directly to racist housing and labor practices. So what should we be taxing? Well, we should be taxing vacant apartments. We should be taxing vacant buildings and vacant land to discourage warehousing and money laundering. We should be taxing banks every time they do a foreclosure. We should be charging a luxury fee on the buyers of property that's worth far more than the median rate. We should be taxing non-primary residents, the 5th and 6th and 7th property that the McCain family owns or whatever. We could do a land value tax, which is the old idea that the value of land is almost entirely socially produced. It has nothing to do with whoever owns it. It's produced by the collectivity, right? It's the state that puts out the roads and the infrastructure that makes that land accessible in the first place. It's us, our neighbors, who build up the culture of a place that make it cool. So maybe nobody should be able to capitalize off of that value, and instead we tax it all away. That's an idea that's like 100 years old. Probably a good idea. Of course, we should also be fighting to raise wages, right? This whole problem could be understood as a problem that the wages are just too low. It's not that the housing costs are too high, it's that the wages are too low for the housing costs. That's important, but we can't just raise the wages if the housing costs continue to go up at the pace that they're going, or we'll have that situation where the money goes from the boss capitalist to the landlord capitalist and you don't get to keep it. But yes, we need to abolish right to work, we need to fight for full unionization, we need to encourage worker-owned co-ops, etc. The thing is, none of this is happening. Right? It's not that we don't have the ideas, it's that we don't have the politics to make them happen. And so, first of all, we need to be dreaming bigger, because if that's not happening, then why should we limit ourselves to what's legal right now? So, you know, we should be thinking of public stewardship over planning, that we can democratize planning so that workers and residents have the ultimate say over changes to the built environment, preservation, demolition, provision of space to different users, modes of moving through the city, etc. The idea that the city should be planned by the people who build it through physical production, but also social reproduction and cultural production, and not just those who own it, which is more or less how the system works right now. And this is not just participation, but to quote myself in the book, seizing the means of spatial production. We should also be thinking about socializing land, not just taxing it away, but land should not be a commodity, right? Whether we could, like, we're socialists, so we don't really believe in commodities anyway, but especially land, it should be commons, right? Land should not be translatable into a dollar count. Homes shouldn't be traded on an open market and transposed into fictitious capital through speculation and securitization. Publicly owned land and buildings shouldn't be treated as budgetary burdens or bargaining chips, but rather as precursors to a decommodified urban future, right? We already have public land, all of it should be public. And then the last thing to think about is a radical form of regionalism, breaking out of this thing where every city plans for itself, and instead, or every nation is at war with each other, because those are kind of the two paradigms that we're living with, and instead thinking about what regional planning could mean. Conservatives tend to like something that they call regionalism also, and so do liberals, but we're talking about socialist regionalism, which would free us to consider the geographical scales at which we want to plan various elements of society. And it's a way out of this devolution and concentration of power that we've got right now. So right now, the federal government demands a whole lot of cities but pays for nothing, right? They want cities to fix their housing problem, but they won't pay for public housing. And the state tells us that we can't fix our rent control laws. So that's a shitty situation. So we need to break out of that, and regionalism is one way to do it. Probably, oh wow, it's much later than I thought. All right, the way we get there is through radical tenant movement. Thank you very much.
You want to sit down and we can pass this back and forth? All right, thank you very much, Samuel. That was really fascinating and infuriating, and I can see from all of your faces that I bet you all have a lot of questions. All right, yes. I mean, can you please just be really loud?
Sure, yeah, I can do that. So I was thinking about many things. It's incredibly helpful talk, but I was specifically thinking a lot about Puerto Rico because, you know, after the hurricane that hit Puerto Rico in 2017, there's been a tremendous escalation of, I mean, there's already a housing crisis, but, you know, on the one hand, many people unable to rebuild their homes, having to leave due to migration, leaving the island. But then there's also, there are parts of San Juan where if you go there, it's a real estate mecca. Like there's just condos being built everywhere. You can go there and there's just the most beautiful, incredible housing. And so I wanted to ask specifically about opportunity zones and what role those play in gentrification. Because Puerto Rico is the only place in the United States that is 100% opportunity zone. And the entire island is an opportunity zone. And I was just wondering, I've been trying to understand a little bit more about what this is supposed to be a way of staving off gentrification or helping poor folks, and I just wanted to know what you think about that.
Sure. I'll answer that, and you might have more to say about opportunity zones. Yeah, I mean, Puerto Rico is a great example of the climate apartheid that is already upon us and may go further. Opportunity zones. So opportunity zones come out of a lineage of other kinds of zones. So it comes out of the Thatcher government, which was pushing enterprise zones. And then Reagan tried to do it, actually failed. Bush tried and failed. Clinton succeeded, as with many other things, and he called it empowerment zones. And these were corporate tax breaks in working class areas. And so, for example, 125th Street in Harlem was one of these. And in the years since the empowerment zone went in, you saw an almost total transformation of that street from small businesses to big chains. You had the entrance of the Harlem USA Mall, which is a Harlem-themed mall that displaced Harlem. So that's kind of like the lineage that it comes out of. And now we have these opportunity zones as a part of the Trump tax breaks, which are absolutely an opportunity for investors. It's a cut on capital gains taxes, which are already severely undertaxed in this country. So it cuts them even more for an extended period in these targeted zones. And the governors got to choose the zones. Do you know who chose it in Puerto Rico?
I mean, perhaps the shitty governor, I don't know.
Perhaps the shitty governor, perhaps they didn't even have the opportunity.
I can say more about the tax breaks going on in Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
Yeah, the government basically said, yeah, make it all an opportunity zone.
Right.
I actually don't know the history.
In most other places, it's a much smaller percentage of the cities that are given over to these. Most of the Bronx is an opportunity zone. A good deal of the Brooklyn, Queens waterfront is an opportunity zone as well. And so it's an encouragement for investors to come in. And it's all under the theory that what's wrong with poor neighborhoods is that they don't have enough luxury real estate investment. And that's what it's going to incentivize, is a bunch of luxury real estate investment, because there's no rules that say the only kind of investment that gets this capital gains cut is one that is affordable or that has community buy-in or whatever else. It's just whatever you want to invest in, and so the most lucrative one is luxury real estate. Do you have more to add?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not the speaker here, but you know, I have a microphone, and someone just asked about empowerment zones, and Sam was could probably sense my like irate-ness. Okay, so Mirza Baradaran has written a lot about the idea that, you know, what our impoverished urban and specifically Black communities need is not resources, redistribution, reparations, services, housing, but capitalism. And so the, you know, and you can really trace Black capitalism as a government-sponsored enterprise from the disinvestment of like urban community organizing and housing development block grants, which stopped in the 1970s and were decimated under Reagan. Opportunity zones are like all these other zones we've had before, but even wilder, because like previous tax reforms, like they weren't even like, hey, let's find some way for people to avoid paying capital gains taxes. Like we were all kind of like cool with capital gains taxes for a long time. And then they're like, I know, what if you didn't have to pay it? And as, you know, some kind of like good, what we can do is draw these zones on maps, and it's huge. Like all of Troy is an opportunity zone. Yeah, and you don't have to do a damn thing besides invest. There's no standards whatsoever that there has to be anything beneficial. You could invest in demolishing an entire like neighborhood in Troy, and the money you spent on the bulldozers, you would get to write off your taxes, because that's literally what opportunity zones are. You could buy a bunch of houses and displace every single tenant in there, and the money you spent would be a tax write-off. So that's opportunity zones. They're not getting a lot of press right now, but they're very, very messed up. And thank you, Sam, for letting me say that. But yeah, do you want to say that?
I just want to add that it was Cuomo who chose where New York's opportunity zones would be through the ESDC, but Trump created this thing. It was sponsored by Cory Booker, by the way, also, and then Cuomo decided where they would go.
We have, oh yes, I'll do this.
Well, that's quick. You mentioned the tenant kind of getting to hold the money for a minute while it goes from his employer to the landlord or the bank. And I read recently that what the worker got was already only 10% of what he made. So he is doing something that produces money for the manufacturer, and yet he loses 90% of the value of that. And so he's only got that little bit, and out of that, a third of it goes for his rent. It just kind of doesn't leave much for the guy working.
Carl was right.
That's what it sounds like.
Yes.
I'm trying to understand land trusts. Can you help me?
Sure. Also, another one Caroline may know more than I do about, but I mean, land trusts in and of themselves, someone said they're awesome. Land trusts in and of themselves are not necessarily awesome. They could be terrible. But community land trusts, which I think is probably what you're referring to, is a form of decommodifying housing now. And so what it does is it relies on two different nonprofit structures. One to own the land, and the other to own whatever's on top of it. Sometimes that's a community garden, sometimes that's a cultural space. Most of the time when I was talking about it, I'm talking about housing. So one nonprofit owns the land, one nonprofit owns the housing. The reason that's important is that the value of one can go up and the other one can't capitalize on it. So the value of the land could go up, but the building owners don't get to capitalize on that value because they don't own the land. The value of the building can go up because let's say that suddenly that form of architecture is highly valued, the landowners can't capitalize on that. And so you're also locked in then to usually a 99-year lease that has very severe limits on what you can do with the property. In most, or I would say the best situations, you have a mutual housing association owning the property, owning the building, which means that the tenants control it themselves. If it's a limited equity co-op, they can't sell it for more than they bought it for in the future, so it stays at the same cost over time. And you can even add something that says when you sell it, you have to sell it to someone who's in the same economic bracket as you were when you bought it. So you can keep the class constitution of the place constant, even if you yourself have done quite well. So let's say you somehow move from being a worker to an owner. When you sell it, it goes back to a worker who is at the point that you were when you bought it. So that's the idea with the community land trust. Do you have more to add? Yeah.
Sorry. Community land trusts were originally, the first community land trust in the US was actually used to preserve black farmlands in the South. And the reason that it's such an effective structure is because you are taking, the way that a lot of communities lose their land is, you can pick off people individually, one by one, especially in areas where you have people, maybe lower income people who aren't doing estate planning, like we're seeing in the Gullah Islands right now. You can get one heir, pick them off, and then you can get the whole land. And that's how communities get displaced. With a community land trust, you have structures in place. And what Samuel was talking about with mutual housing associations is really the model for a lot of cities, but you also have a lot of homeownership focused ones. And the biggest, does anyone know the city with the biggest community land trust coverage in the country? Yeah, Burlington, Vermont. Bernie Sanders was actually the pioneer of the application of the CLT model to housing in the US. So there's a gentleman who's really up there.
Hi, thanks for being out. My name is Frank. I'm the North Central Community and Solidarity Group here in Troy. I'm their director, I'm their CEO. That means anything north of Hoosier Street all the way down to 111. However, our big thing is Hillside North. And so we welcome you here. One of the things is we don't really get a lot of information before this, that this is actually going to happen. right in this neighborhood, and this is a predominantly black neighborhood, or people of color, although white is a color too. So, all right, so that includes everybody. Sometimes we say people of color, does that exclude white? No, they're a color too, so we can talk about everyone, okay? So first thing we want to know is when you do come, because these are very informative, and this is one that they really need to know because they're putting up a lot of these extravagant new apartment building complexes here, and none of our people are being a part of it at all. All right, and so they're a little like frustrated with that. They're coming, they're taking over all the businesses and things like that. So again, we welcome you, we thank you, okay, but what we want to know is, first and foremost, I'm a medic, I take care of trach patients, so that's why I'm late, pardon me, okay, but they trusted me to get the information that is here. So this is one of the ones we were really on, but I couldn't get here until now, or just a few minutes ago. So one of the first things we want to know is there a tape?
Yes, I want to know too. How do we get that?
That we can use. Yep. We also have another meeting. We have a meeting that is going to come up on the 11th of June, right? That's the second Tuesday in June, and we'd like, if we could, to have someone speak, at that meeting about something here, so we can have the contact information about that too. We'd really appreciate that. This information is kind of foreign to the people here. All we know is people are being pushed out, others are coming in, and we don't know them. They hardly speak our language. Not that that's a wrong thing, but this information is so important right now, right here.
I'm right with him.
We're just
I don't
asking
know
that if
anything.
you could please, you know what I mean, extend yourself to that, or if there's anything that you can offer us, we'll gladly open our.
You guys are way
also,
talking
very
way over my head
interested part
too.
of
I'm taking notes.
Recommendation, all everybody that is here, so that we can get this for you again. We can make it happen. You know what I mean? Almost immediately soon. But whatever it is, okay. So we're very ready, willing, and able to have this information and not be overlooked.
Thank you. To answer the first question, do you want to talk about how to get the videotape and all that?
Yeah, we videotape all these forums. And if you Google James Connolly Forum, you'll find the website. And we post a link to all the videos for the forums on that website. Okay? So that's all you have to do, James Connolly Forum. Okay. And we're making a tape of this right now as we speak. Okay. So if anything you missed, you'll be able to see.
How do we get someone, like on June 11th, when we have our thing, we're gonna have everyone from the mayor all the way down here, because it's election time and they're here. They're gonna show up, they want the votes, okay? But we want the information to get out. We want someone to come in, because we're not as well versed, especially in this, we're not as well educated, especially in this, as you are. So if we can have someone here, we're willing to compensate, whatever it takes to make it happen. We're in a position now to do it. We've just had the lieutenant governor come 2 blocks away at school too. She brought $600,000 with her. She said this is where it's gonna go. No one here has a clue where that's really going, how it's gonna really affect what's going on. We can please, you know what I mean? We certainly appreciate it, and we're willing to do whatever it takes to, enhance it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's, first of all, yes, we can definitely, I can't speak for Sam, but, as a Troy housing, advocate, we can definitely, it won't be me because I won't be in town, but we can definitely send someone to your meeting. We have a volunteer, done. Yes, you're getting a person. I don't know, Sam, if you want to talk about, make any plans to this month here?
Right, I can't commit to anything right now, but I'd be happy to share resources, shorter versions of this talk, written stuff, anything. So we can talk afterward.
And just one more thing, if I may. I'm sorry to take up everyone's time. And again, we welcome you to the North Central area. Thanks for coming, okay? But there's no one, I'm looking around right now, and I really don't see anyone from the North Central area that's here. However, I know they're all concerned. You know what I mean? I know that they trust that the information I'm gonna give them, you know what I mean, is up to par. So we noticed that you called this the New Brooklyn, okay? And so we were like, the New Brooklyn. Okay, we don't want to really be Brooklyn. Okay, we want to just be Troy, and we want to just live Troy, run Troy. Okay, so if you can just, why in fact you just said the New Brooklyn, and just a little bit.
Yeah. I was saying that when I Googled Troy and gentrification, those were the headlines that were coming up. So I wasn't saying like, I'm saying this is the new Brooklyn. I'm saying that someone is trying to put out the idea that Troy is the new Brooklyn, and I'm saying that that's because they're trying to promote the same gentrification model that took place in Brooklyn in Troy. I'm certainly not saying that that's a good thing or that it's even happening.
Outstanding.
Yeah.
If you can give me context, because I'm in constant communication and contact with Monica Kay, who's the deputy mayor, who really like does the same for the mayor here.
Right.
You know, and she was very concerned when she heard like gentrification. What, the new Brooklyn? She was very concerned. but okay, so we're dealing with that. But I'm gonna deal with this gentleman here, and I really thank you again. No essential thanks you. We welcome you. Thanks.
Thank you.
And we'll stay on board. Thank you.
All right, Dan?
Hey, great talk. Two things. One, I think it's always important to point out that when you say 30% of your paycheck is maximum 48%, that's like saying if you get paid twice a month, one of your paychecks is kicked in the ass,
right.
You don't get it. And that kind of helps explain kind of the ongoing monthly crisis that is being a renter. Which kind of gets to the thing I'm like interested in is like there seems to be this like very strong like paternalism of renting. Like if you go to landlords, they gave this line about how I'm providing you service because I'm renting to you. And you go to planners, and they're like, we care about people. We don't believe that some people are ready to or able to own, so they rent. And even renters will say this, which sounds a little bit like someone saying, I can't afford to be in my own union. It's like very, especially given that we recognize that if you want to benefit under capitalism, I mean very literally as a country that began on the basis of landowning bourgeois democracy, why are we still so obsessed with the idea that renting is a necessity, as opposed to saying renting may be an unfortunate reality, but ultimately what we want is people to own a piece of something who's valuable. Why is there a resistance to saying the goal is to abolish renting because there's just no need to rent anymore?
I want to make sure I understand the premise of the question, because there's kind of like there's the opposite that sometimes gets said, which is like, or the same thing but from the opposite political perspective, which is renting is bad, therefore everyone should be a homeowner, which is also unsatisfying, right? First of all, everyone doesn't have the money to be a homeowner and won't under conditions of capitalism. And second of all, if everyone was a homeowner, that wouldn't necessarily be good either. It would be everyone for themselves, and et cetera, et cetera. And this was this is what Engels wrote about in the housing question, when there was a proposal for basically every worker should take over their housing and become a homeowner. And he said, like, this is never going to work. You can't solve the problem of capitalism from the housing question. You can only go in the other direction. So then, getting back to, why are people attached to the idea that there will always be renters? I think it's kind of the same as why are people attached to the solution is home ownership. I think they're kind of both bad.
Right.
They're both, they're certainly, it's no fun being a renter and paying all this money to a landlord who owns your property and who doesn't reinvest that money in their property, and you're just sort of like paying their kids' college tuition or whatever. It's also not fun being a homeowner with a high monthly mortgage and the knowledge that if you don't pay that every month, you could lose your home.
Exactly.
And so those are two bad situations for the working class under capitalism. We need other situations. So I think the problem is often that we have these two models, and so then we toggle between them. If you're a renter, you see home ownership as the solution. If you're an owner, you might see renting as the problem. But either one is insufficient on its own, which is where we get into public housing, community land trusts, mutual housing associations, limited equity co-ops, anything that takes us out of that binary of renting and homeownership, which most of us will never win by, except a lucky few who then become kind of enemies to the rest of the class.
Okay, so we're doing, yes, there, yes.
So related question, can you talk a little bit about cooperative economics and how that can be a really beneficial tool of liberation, and how it can also be co-opted, for lack of a better word?
Right, I mean, I guess cooperative economics, the idea that even under the conditions of capitalism, we can create alternative structures that are cooperatively owned and managed, and get us out of that renter-owner binary. In the case of housing, I think it's very promising when there are limits placed on it, when there are tight conditions around what you do once you're a cooperative, as in a limited equity co-op. When those things aren't there, you become just as exclusionary as anybody else. You just happen to own your building or set of buildings cooperatively. So like the co-ops in Manhattan on the Upper West Side or something, they're extremely expensive. The boards are notoriously racist. And yes, they're cooperatively owned, but they manage themselves just like a capitalist firm. The limited equity cooperatives, on the other hand, have rules in place that prevent them from that action, even if the individuals involved would otherwise behave that way. So I think it's promising, but not in and of itself.
All right, we have time for a couple more. So this gentleman was waiting.
I just want to try to connect a couple of pieces that I heard you saying. Early on in the talk, you said that quantitative easing is kind of like creating money. And I thought that's interesting because it didn't lead to inflation. Mm-hmm. And so there are probably 1,000 good reasons why the economy didn't sort of grow massively, even though money was being created magically. And then you talked about the extent to which the creation of these gentry zones partly is a result of deindustrialization, which seems to be a bad thing for living conditions, political possibilities. So I couldn't help thinking about the extent to which the analysis you were providing was about a series of profound sort of warpings or distortions, because we're sort of in a number of very important places under the reign of finance capital. Not industrial capital, not even merchant capital, but finance capital. Concentrated, strong, wanting to have more and more and more. So the polarization comes from that. So in a sense, I'm having a little trouble seeing where collectively people kind of see the politics for these kinds of changes coming from. And I say that in part as somebody who lived for 3 years in a limited equity co-op in Philadelphia, and it was my little paradise. I didn't have a mortgage, which I've had for 30 years, and I didn't have a landlord. It was just a golden moment, and they had a very particular structure. Your buy-in, your ownership was based on your first month's rent, and you got your first month's rent plus whatever the interest rate had been when you sold it or left. And that was like a very nice place. The roof didn't get fixed and the rent didn't get raised unless you made that decision collectively. So I kind of understand that, the power of collectivities. But it does seem like it's hard to sort of see where the strategic points for these kinds of fundamental changes are.
Okay, great question. Quantitative easing not leading to inflation is a problem that a lot of economists are trying to figure out. I'm not one of them, but it is interesting. But then think about what did inflate? Housing costs. Mm-hmm. And some people are saying that basically the radical inflation of housing costs picked up all the slack in the economy anywhere else, right? Food prices were stable, oil prices were stable, all these other prices were stable, except housing just went through the roof, so to speak. Finance capital, very important. Also, who benefited from quantitative easing? Like, it's not that all of us saw our bank account suddenly have a couple zeros on top of it. It was the banks had the zeros. So that was a direct aid to finance capital. So it is incredibly important. But then once people start talking about finance, they get really hopeless because it's this giant concentration of capital, which makes sense. I think the other way to think about it is like they're taking a lot of risk. Finance capital has invested tremendous amounts of money into the built environments of a few cities. Like I said at the beginning, it's not like the entire country, the entire world is gentrifying. It's like few places. And it's even granular within those places, which assumes constantly rising profits, which assumes constantly rising land and property values translated into rents. That's why at the end, and I cut myself off, I said the only way out is through the tenant movement. To think of that in the same way as sometimes people sort of like idealistically talk about the logistics sector of the economy being the way that workers could have the most power. Like if we shut down the ports and if we shut down the Amazon warehouses and if we did all these things in those places where globalization becomes very real, where all the stuff gets concentrated and then goes out, that's a place of enormous potential worker power. Think of the same thing of the tenant movements in these places where way too much capital has been invested under the premise that their rents will go up and up and up and up. a very disruptive tenant movement in those places can have some of the same functions politically as a very disruptive labor movement in those logistics clusters.
We only have time for one more question, and we have gender equity in moderation, so I will last question to you.
All right. One of the things that we're seeing in Albany is the massive building of new apartments, that they can be very small. They'll begin at $1,000 a month for 1 bedroom, and 2 bedrooms, 1,500. Students near the university. Very, very high prices for someone who has a regular mortgage on their home and would pay half of that. What can you say about that trend? Why that's where I would say in Albany the real expansion is in the development of these apartments?
Yeah, I mean, my first response hearing that was, it's not for workers, right? It's for retired seniors, or it's for college students. So the assumption is you have money from somewhere else. Savings, pension, or parents. So they can charge what they charge, not under the assumption that wages are commensurate with that. They charge it on the assumption that some people have a lot of money to spend on housing. So that's one way of explaining that boom, and there are enough people who are interested in either retiring to these places or being students in these places who have fewer of their own options, right? It's not like our pensions are doing so well in general. So sometimes people are buying these properties, if they're not rentals, if they're condos, as investments, because they have no other equity. And so they put their equity into these places, and it becomes a personalized retirement strategy. There's no way that all of us can do that.
Right.
It becomes a thing that works for a relatively few, a small person. Right. But a big enough one that there's quite a market for it.
Yeah, it's expanding everywhere. This is a new development.
Yeah, I mean, and it's the kind of development that you might have seen in some other places now coming to places that were more targets of disinvestment for a long time.
Exactly.
We were talking about that in the case of Troy earlier over dinner, that you know, New York City, as Caroline said, could be seen as like the late stage model of gentrification, whereas Troy is maybe an early stage model. And Troy is a place, in Albany too, where there was a lot of investment and then a lot of disinvestment, which creates the conditions for a lot of reinvestment with potentially very high profit margins. So I would say that that's how you can understand what's going on in these places. Is it's the third stage. After investment, after disinvestment comes reinvestment.
So one thing that Sam has not done is mention that he has a book, Capital City, and so I had a two-part question, one-part question, one-part comment. And the question is, since you don't have your book with you tonight, where can we buy your book?
So I wish I could tell you that there was a local bookstore that was carrying it, but my understanding is there might not be. So you should ask. Go to your local bookstore and ask them to order it. Capital City by Samuel Stein. If you want to order it online, get it from Verso Books, which is my publisher. Verso, V-E-R-S-O, is currently on sale, 30% off. And that's the best deal for me.
Do not buy it on Amazon.
Don't buy it on Amazon.
So if I can just read a very short, part from this book that I thought really kind of encapsulates what Samuel is talking about with, the real estate state and how it kind of warps the reality of what we see and feel around us, what we perceive to be right and what we're told is inevitable. By choice or by force, planners use gentrification to create the physical environments for capital to thrive. It is the process by which cities seek capital and capital seeks land. Its endgame is a city controlled by bankers and developers, run like a corporation, designed as a luxury product, and planned by the finance sector. What was public becomes private. What was common becomes enclosed. What was cheap becomes expensive. What was shared becomes traded. Through the real estate state, the city becomes gentrified. Through gentrification, the city becomes neoliberal. And this is just, yeah, that I have like come back to a lot because I think it really captures kind of where we are right now. And fortunately, we've also discussed a lot of ways out, so I don't want to end on this like gloomy note, but yeah, check out the book. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and especially thank Sam for coming to speak to us tonight.